All right, so my name is John Michaels, and this is my partner in crime and fiance, Katie Bennemen. The name of our firm, Stronghold Financial. And what we're going to cover today is obviously the immense and rising cost of long-term care and what to do about it. So specifically on the agenda is how people pay for long-term care. There's three ways that we'll cover. Then we'll get into the Arizona long-term care system, or LtC as it's known. We'll jump right in from there into a specific client case study, because we can sit here and teach you all everything about LtC, but it doesn't really resonate until you understand it in the context of real people and how they applied it to their lives. We'll talk about some common LtC myths. There's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about LtC in the marketplace. We want to make sure that we kind of bust those myths, because a lot of people are taking bad advice and implementing it in their lives, and it's turning into bad scenarios and situations for them. And then we'll get into specifically how people qualify for LtC. This is kind of the meat of the presentation. There's a lot to know about how you qualify for LtC, both on the medical side and the financial side, and you have to qualify for both in order to be eligible for LtC. So we're going to cover that so that everyone here feels comfortable, that they understand the program, they understand what problem it solves, and whether it would be sensible for them to take a closer look at it now or in the future. All right. So there's three ways, as I mentioned, how people pay for long-term care. They can either pay for it out of pocket, which frankly, these days, a small percentage of the population has the assets and the income to be able to support an endeavor like that. The national average for long-term care on a monthly basis is about $8,000 a month. Obviously, that can fluctuate. We've got clients that are in skilled nursing and they pay $20,000 a month. And then we have people that are in group community homes that are paying $2,500 a month. So it runs the gamut, but 8,000 is the average. And most people haven't done the financial planning to work out an $8,000 a month additional expense for an indeterminate period of time. The issue with long-term care is no one knows how long they're going to need it, right? And we, people, frankly, that have Alzheimer's, for example, can be very physically healthy, but they need care, they need hands-on help living their lives, and that can go on for years. So at $8,000 a month, I mean, you're looking right about $100,000 a year. If you live 5 years, that's $500,000. I mean, not a lot of people have that socked away extra. So paying out of pocket ends up being something that's really not a very tenable strategy for most people. The second way that you can pay for long-term care is if you were lucky enough to buy a solid long-term care insurance policy back in the day. These policies kind of showed up in the 80s and 90s and late 90s, and they've really changed a lot. The economics behind those policies has changed a lot. And so they almost don't even exist anymore. You can't even buy a pure long-term care insurance policy anymore. But if you have one from the old days and you haven't dropped and your insurance carrier hasn't gone out of business, they're certainly very helpful. Less than 15% of the population today has long-term care insurance at all. And of those, maybe, again, another 20% or so have a long-term care policy that offers enough benefit to cover their actual long-term care needs, given how expensive it's grown to be today. So a very, very small percentage of the population is going to be able to rely on long-term care insurance to get them by. So that leaves us with then the third way that people pay for long-term care, which is nationally the Medicaid long-term care system. And here in Arizona, it's known as LtC, the Arizona Long-Term Care System, which is a division of Medicaid. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. One really important note is that Medicare does not cover long-term care. So it seems like it ought to. It's got care in the name, but actually Medicare will cover up to 100 days of rehabilitation and long-term care assistance, and then it will completely drop coverage. So if you're going to need that level of care for more than 100 days max, Medicare won't cover it, and that's why we're here talking about Medicaid today. going the wrong way with it. Okay, so now let's talk about the Arizona long-term care system, LtC. So first of all, how is the organization structured? So maybe some of you have heard of the department Access, AHCCCS, or the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. That is Arizona Medicaid. And Medicaid is funded both at the state and federal level by your tax dollars. So what happens is that every state, including Arizona, submits an annual budget for what they think their Medicaid budget is going to be. And then the federal government matches that, in the case of Arizona, 50 cents on the dollar. So for example, if Arizona submits $1 billion budget for fiscal year or calendar year 2022, then the US government will match that with 500 million for a total of $1.5 billion in the budget. And again, those dollars are coming from our taxes. So you've been paying into the Medicaid system going all the way back to when you were a young adult and paying income taxes both at the state and federal level. The purpose of LtC, like why it exists, and this, by the way, is more of a street level understanding of what LtC really is. This is a definition that we wrote from years of having implemented this program for people. It's to keep mostly seniors and the elderly out of the hospital due to chronic conditions or other illnesses or physical or mental lack of capacity that diminish their ability to perform the adult activities of daily living, or ADLs as they're known. So that's really the primary purpose of this program. If you think about it, somebody who can't care for themselves, and we'll talk about the ADLs here in a bit, but somebody who can't care for themselves in that respect, their risk to injure themselves, whether they're a fall risk or they forget and leave the stove and set the house on fire, or they're a wandering risk and they end up in the middle of the street. The net of it is that if they can't care for themselves, they're either going to be a danger to themselves or others. And so people are going to end up in the hospital. And when people end up in the hospital, then the Medicare budget kicks in. And we're talking tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in total medical bills when someone goes to the hospital these days. So the purpose of LtC is to almost be a financial shield to keep people out of the hospital, so that they're saying we'd much rather pay a few $1,000s a month to many $1,000s a month to keep people out of the hospital versus having to pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars and load up the hospitals with people that otherwise potentially we could have prevented from being there. So let's talk about the activities of daily living so that you understand. Again, LtC is meant for people that need help, that need assistance, a hands-on level of assistance with these activities. So some of them are pretty straightforward, like mobility is obviously your ability to walk around. Transferring means your ability to get up from a stationary location, like your bed or the couch, and move to another location, like a walker or a wheelchair. Bathing is self-explanatory, dressing is self-explanatory. Eating does not include meal preparation. I just want to be kind of clear about that. Eating is literally the physical activity of cutting your food, putting it on a fork or a spoon, putting it in your mouth, being able to chew and swallow, without being a choke risk. Anything else related to the process of eating doesn't count. So I just wanted to cover that. I'll skip across to toileting, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then grooming is an extra ADL that Arizona adds into their list of ADLs. Not all other states have grooming, but they find that clipping your nails and keeping your hair clean and tidy, brushing your teeth, keeping your mouth clean. These are some of the things that Arizona looks at as being pretty important in terms of an activity of daily living, and they want you to have the ability to do that. So let's get into a specific example of how much LtC would cover, if you needed long-term care. So first of all, the applicant, the person who needs care, their income is going to be used for their share of cost first, assuming that they're going into an actual community where they're going to be receiving care. So they get to keep about $126 a month for their own personal needs. LtC calls that your personal needs allowance. So we're going to get into an example here in a second, but $126 you get to keep at each month. And then generally, if you're an unmarried person anyway, the rest of your income is going to go towards your share of costs if you're going to live in a community. LtC will then cover the gap between your cost of care and whatever your income is minus the $126. So for most people, that's a significant gap. For example, a typical private pay cost of care these days is around $5,000 a month. That's for an assisted living level of care. The community that you might consider living in that is charging you the $5,000 a month has a contracted rate with LtC. So they have a pre-negotiated rate with LtC, and a typical pre-negotiated rate on a $5,000 a month facility or community would be about $3,900 a month. So LtC is actually going to pay less for the same level of care than you would pay if you were going to pay out of pocket. So there is that little that gap there. Let's say, for argument's sake, for the purpose of this example, that your income was $1,500 a month, Social Security, let's say. So if you were going to walk into this community, you would be $3,500 short because you make $1,500 and the community charges $5,000. So clearly, you wouldn't be able to afford to live there. Enter LtC. So of your $1,500, $1,374 would go towards your share of costs because you are expected to pay for your own living expenses. You get to keep, again, $126 for personal needs, and then LtC would pick up that gap of $2,526 per month. Something important to point out is that the cost of long-term care generally increases with the rate of inflation, which up until the past year or so was cruising along at about 1.5%, 2% per year. As we all know, because we read the news and watch the news, inflation has gone absolutely bonkers, right? And we're looking at 7.5%, 8%. So you can expect that for the foreseeable future, the cost of long-term care is going to be going up kind of in coincidence with inflation, which is really unfortunate for everybody who needs long-term care. The good news is LtC will continue to pick up the gap between your income and your cost of care. So as your cost of care goes up and your Social Security goes up, whatever that gap is, year after year after year, LtC will continue to pay that gap as long as you remain eligible for the program. That's really a key thing to point out. So I'm going to turn this over to my much, much better half, Katie, and she's going to take you through an actual client case. This is an actual client of ours, a very beloved client of ours, and we think that this story is really enlightening and will probably open your eyes quite a bit to who LtC is really for and what problem it solves.
And one thing real quick before I launch into this, just to kind of piggyback on what John was just explaining in terms of an LtC member's share of cost. It is going to vary if someone is a part of a married couple versus unmarried. Sometimes their share of cost comes down lower. And then it's also going to vary based on whether or not they're receiving services in a community or a facility type setting, like John mentioned, versus at home. So LtC does offer the ability to offer in-home coverage no more than 40 hours a week. So it's not necessarily an appropriate fit for certain individuals if they require more than 40 hours a week of care that can't be supplemented by a child, a spouse, some kind of friend or family member. Just know that if someone is residing in home, receiving their LtC services in home, then that share of cost isn't necessarily going to be as high as what John was just walking you through either. So what he explained was pretty much the worst case scenario that you're looking at, and just know that depending on specific circumstances, it could actually be less. So what I'm going to walk you through here this morning is a little story about Ernest and Charlene, two of our clients from years ago. Ernest at the time was 73 years old and extremely healthy. And Charlene was 72 at the time, and she's had MS for years. So for years now, she's been in a wheelchair full-time. Her condition's been declining over the years, which is understandable. It's not curable. She's not going to improve at any point in the future. She still had the ability to use her arms fully, but obviously being wheelchair bound makes performing activities of daily living a little challenging, especially as you continue to age, lose strength, that sort of thing. So at the time that we met with them, they were residing in an independent living community, and they had about $700,000 total net worth. And then they also had a home property as well that they owned free and clear at the time. Ernest at the time was Charlene's full-time caregiver for anything that she needed help with that she wasn't able to handle herself. But it was really starting to get to the point where he wasn't able to provide the care that she needs on a daily basis. I mean, it's really challenging to bear the majority or all of someone's body weight when they're not able to participate in those activities of daily living themselves. And Ernest was aging. He was starting to have some health problems as well as time was going on. So they were looking at moving Charlene into the assisted living portion of the community. They were going to move together into an assisted living apartment. Ernest would still be independent, but Charlene would start to partake in the community's assisted living services that were provided. And moving into the assisted living apartment was going to cost them an additional $3,500 a month above and beyond what they were already paying to live inside the community. And they knew Charlene's father had actually lived in the same community until he had passed away years prior, and she had handled all of his finances for him. So she was very familiar with how that cost of care was increasing over the years while her father had been in the community as well. So they were extremely concerned about inflation, like John had been talking about. And they also knew that as Charlene's condition continued to decline and she needed more and more and more hands-on help, that the cost was going to increase as well, just due to needing the higher level of care than where she was planning on starting out at. Obviously, no one has a crystal ball to know how long anyone's going to live, but just looking at actuarial tables, we knew that Charlene was just statistically expected to live for another 16 years based on her age at the time. And so she and Ernest were really terrified about what was going to happen to Ernest if Charlene lived this long, physically healthy, other than the MS causing her to need assistance with the activities of daily living. And so they were really worried about what's going to happen if we blow through the $700,000 of assets that we've worked so hard to save, and Ernest is left with nothing. And so that was really the premise of what brought them to us in the first place, was planning ahead to make sure that Ernest was going to be protected, regardless of how much money might need to be spent on Charlene's long-term care costs over the years. So in qualifying Charlene for the LtC program, we were able to obtain over $4,000 a month of benefits for her. So that's the monthly gap that LtC was covering between Charlene's share of cost and the cost at the facility. And simultaneously, we were able to preserve 100% of the combined marital assets for Ernest. So the $700,000 that we sat down and talked with them about, figured out that they have in all of these various accounts, we were able to preserve 100% of that for Ernest in the process. Now, that might sound odd to some of you, depending on what experience you have with Medicaid or LtC specifically. You've probably heard rumors that you have to spend down, and you've got to spend down until it's gone and gone forever in order to be financially eligible for the program. And that's one of the myths that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail as we get through the presentation. But bottom line is, when we go through the Medicaid application process, the LtC application process, the very first thing that happens is LtC determines what the total countable assets are for a married couple. And so in Ernest and Charlene's case, like I mentioned, they had about $700,000 total. The individual who's receiving the LtC services is allowed to have no more than $2,000 of counted assets in their name in order to be financially eligible for the program. The healthy spouse is referred to by LtC as the community spouse, and they're allowed to have a community spouse resource allowance. The calculation is different. It's going to work a little bit different for everybody based on what your total countable assets might be as a married couple. But in Ernest and Charlene's situation at the time, Ernest was allowed to have $137,400 in his name in order to be financially eligible for the LtC program. And so on the surface, if Ernest and Charlene had just gone to the LtC office themselves, called the LtC office themselves directly, LtC would have done this assessment and said, you guys need to spend down $560,600 in order to be financially eligible for this program. So go do that and then come back and see us and apply for the program at that time.
Yeah, and just something I wanted to point out, Katie and everybody in the audience, LtC won't give you advice or guidance or any instructions at all on how to successfully navigate their program. They just don't, they won't do it. They don't do it. They will specifically tell you that. So from their perspective, they'll tell you to go spend down, even if that is detrimental to your own finances. That's the most guidance that they will provide you, which is why, you know, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, it's such a good idea to know what you're doing or engage with kind of a firm like ours. So because we can help you navigate through, you know, what's probably the best approach to take for your individual situation. LtC isn't going to tell you.
And it's not because they don't necessarily want to, it's that they're legally not allowed to,
Right.
Unfortunately. So some of the employees over there do know that strategies like this exist, but they're limited in terms of what they're allowed to say to you on the phone. So going back to Ernest and Charlene's situation and their options, we helped them understand that, you know, option one is you literally just start spending down, and after $560,000 and some change has been spent down out of pocket, then you guys could go qualify for the Medicaid program, the LtC program at that point in time. Obviously, there are a lot of downsides to doing that. You can only qualify for Medicaid once you've spent it all down. So it's gone and gone forever. It leaves them with only $139,400 combined total between the two of them. Plus they would have had the house and the car that they have. So it would have left them with about 20% of their current net worth. The one pro, if there is any in the situation, is that they would have kept 100% of Charlene's Social Security income, but obviously that would have just been going right back out the door to the assisted living community. And so it really wouldn't have been a pro at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. What we showed Ernest and Charlene that was appropriate for their specific situation, I want to stress that this was appropriate for their specific situation. This is not the appropriate approach for everybody. It's not appropriate to use cookie cutter solutions with LtC planning. It's really important that if and when you do engage with a firm now or in the future, that you make sure that the firm is customizing a plan very specific to you and your spouses, if you have one, to your financial situation, where all of the assets are currently, how are they titled, are they pre-tax or post-tax dollars, things of that nature. So it really does need to be a customized plan. This was the most appropriate plan for Ernest and Charlene. Rather than Ernest and Charlene spending down the $560,000 and some change, we were able to reposition it into what's called a Medicaid compliant annuity. Some of you may be familiar with annuities already. You might have annuities. You might have heard of them before. This is a very unique type of annuity. You would never use this type of annuity for any reason other than for qualifying for Medicaid. Not meant to be an investment. It's literally just a means to an end to protect the assets from not having to be spent down so they're gone and gone forever. So when we reposition the assets into this very specific type of annuity for Ernest and Charlene, we were able to immediately qualify them for the LtC program. The way that the annuity is structured, we show all kinds of documentation to the LtC office. There's nothing weird about this. People ask us all the time, is this legal? Yes, it is legal. We have to show a tremendous amount of documentation to the LtC office so that they see that it was done properly, that the annuity meets the criteria that it needs to meet in order to work for Medicaid qualification purposes. So they look at all of this information and they say, well, Ernest and Charlene did what we asked them to do. They spent down the the $560,000 and some change by putting it into this Medicaid compliant annuity. And so because we've achieved the spend down requirement on paper, they stamp the approval on the application, we get them approved. So the question then becomes, what happens to the $560,000 that was repositioned into the annuity? What we've done is we've converted it into an income stream. Instead of it being an asset, it's now an income. And the annuity is going to pay back to Ernest, the healthy spouse, over some period of time. We always want it to return the funds to Ernest, the healthy spouse, as quickly as humanly possible. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But bottom line is, as Ernest is getting these annuity payments back from the insurance company, he's able to go reposition the annuity payments into his bank account, a bank account in his name, and they can accumulate back up. He can have liquidity in his bank account. He can start putting money back into his various investment accounts. Wherever he wants the money to be is perfectly fine, as long as it's after the LtC application has been approved. And I know that sounds a little odd, but someone could literally win the lottery. And as long as they put the $300 million that they win into a bank account in the healthy spouse's name, not in the spouse who's on the LtC program, the spouse on the LtC program will not lose their benefits. So it's okay for Ernest to be receiving this income back over time and putting the assets back into a bank account in his name only. The one con here, if there is one, is that, like John talked about, the vast majority of Charlene's Social Security income was going to go to the assisted living community as her room and board payment, her LtC share of cost. And she was allowed to keep, at the time, it was about a $117 a month personal needs allowance. Now it's up to $126 a month for inflation. But obviously having that $4,000 a month gap covered between Charlene's Social Security and her cost of care, and Ernest over time getting back all $560,000 rather than spending it down, was the ideal outcome rather than not qualifying for the program in their situation.
Right. By the way, a bit of housekeeping that I should have mentioned at the beginning, and apologies that I didn't. It might be an orderly approach if you guys want to use the chat to start asking questions, because that way we don't have a bunch of people all bunched up at the end talking over each other to articulate their questions to us. So if you're familiar with Zoom and you're comfortable opening up the chat window and typing your questions in the chat, at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those first, and hopefully we get everyone's questions answered in a nice orderly way. And then if there's any follow-on questions after all the things have been typed in chat, we're happy to take those and answer them at that point in time. So thanks for that.
So throughout the process of working with Ernest and Charlene to achieve financial eligibility for them, we are very hands-on with that. We have to be, because it's really important to determine which assets are going to be kept by Ernest as part of the $139,400 that he and Charlene can have between the two of them. And in their situation, they did have some pre-tax accounts, they had post-tax accounts, and it was important to try to implement the best possible solution for them based on tax implications. We don't want to be repositioning assets in a way that's going to create a taxable event if we can avoid doing that. So those are the types of things that need to be taken into consideration as you're going through the actual implementation of the plan. So we figured out which assets were going to be retained. The remainder of the assets, the $560,000 and some change, were deposited into the Medicaid compliant annuity. In their situation, we recommended a 6-year term, which means that it was a 6-year return of the funds to Ernest. That was the shortest period of time we were able to responsibly use in Ernest's situation. Again, everyone's situation is different. In that case, it was just under an $8,000 a month payment that was made to Ernest every single month over the course of the 6 years. What we're typically trying to accomplish is keeping Ernest's total income, the healthy spouse's total income, to around $10,000 a month. if we were to say, let's put $560,000 into the annuity and let's return it to Ernest over 2 months, the LtC office would have some raised eyebrows about that, right? So there's a proper way to go about it where we know that we're not going to raise any red flags over at the LtC office by returning the funds too quickly. But at the same time, we're mindful of the client's perspective, which is, the client wants those funds returned to them as quickly as possible so that they can have control over that money again, have it in their bank accounts, have it in their investment accounts, have it working for them to earn a higher rate of return than what the annuity is paying back to them, which is really minimal. Did I miss anything there?
No, not at all. Ready,
All right.
ready to go.
So bottom line is what makes more sense in that particular situation? Does it make more sense for Ernest and Charlene to have spent down $560,000? So it's gone and gone forever, very financially uncomfortable position for Ernest to have been in? Or does it make sense to reposition the assets into this solution, have them returned to Ernest over the course of 6 years? And John always uses the analogy of the bucket or the boomerang, right? So the bucket is the assets are spent. They're basically just flushed down the toilet, right? The boomerang is you're putting them off on the side temporarily and they're returning back over time.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So I see people are starting to ask questions, which is awesome. Thank you for that. Continue to use the chat. I'm going to take back over here and talk a little bit about common LtC myths. And this is it's one slide and it's kind of comical because what you're going to see on this slide are verbatim statements, comments, exclamations made to us and others by people in the senior care industry who frankly should know better. This is the bad advice on the left-hand side that is being given. This is the misinformation that is being passed around, and people are taking it to heart. And it's actually become common wisdom, some of these myths. Like this is just what people think because it's what everybody says. And in no case are any of these things true. So the first one is LtC is only for broke people. Well, sure, if you call the LtC office and they tell you to spend down $560,000 and leave you with 20% of your net worth, you could make a case that myth is true, but it's not true because frankly, we have a number of strategies, the Medicaid compliant annuity just being one of them, but there's a number of strategies that can be brought to bear where if you have sometimes millions of dollars in assets, Medicaid could actually make sense for you and we can help you achieve eligibility. Second one, you have to spend down all your assets to qualify for LtC. So the government law that actually allows for the repositioning of assets using Medicaid compliant annuities and others was the Federal Deficit Reduction Act passed by George W. Bush in 2005. So Katie mentioned earlier, people ask us all the time, is this stuff legal? Like, are you allowed to do this? And the answer is, of course, yes. We have no interest in going to jail or have our clients go to jail. But the specific law that allows for these repositioning of assets is the Federal Deficit Reduction Act of 2005. Number three, we haven't talked about this yet, but we will here in a bit. And if you kind of heard some of the rumors, about the 5-year look back, the dreaded 5-year look back. The 5-year look back won't allow for any movement of money. If I have, given my grandchildren birthday gifts, I'm not going to be eligible for the LtC program, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a myth because first of all, amongst spouses, like in the case of Ernest and Charlene, assets can be retitled to a healthy spouse with no penalty whatsoever. So even if you gave, even if Charlene gave Ernest $100,000 yesterday, that's not going to disqualify her from Medicaid eligibility on the program today. Assets and property can be intentionally gifted and repositioned to non-spouses. If you're unmarried, if you're widowed, if you're divorced, you can intentionally gift to your children, to your grandchildren, to a charity. You will take a penalty, and we're going to talk about how that penalty is calculated here in a little bit. But sometimes it actually makes more sense to do that depending upon each person's individual situation. I will say a very, very strong warning. If you think that you're coming up in need for Medicaid, don't be gifting your assets away unless you're talking to, an expert, because you can actually do a lot more damage than you're intending to do. So I'm not advising anybody to gift their assets away. I want to be really clear about that. We would only advise you to do that in very specific situations where we've done the math and it makes sense. Number 4, it can take 3 to 6 months to get LtC approval. Actually, that's being generous. We've had clients that have come to us that were trying to handle the application process themselves, and they were 1 year deep into the process, and they still hadn't gotten on the program. They'd gotten rejected 3 or 4 times, and they were banging their head against a brick wall. Our firm gets approvals in 3 to 6 weeks on average. The simpler cases take 3, the more sophisticated and complex cases take 6. There's just a right way to go about this stuff. And I'm not going to get into all the gory details of right or wrong and how we get those approvals so fast. But that is kind of our reputation in the market, is we're the fastest and the friendliest LtC planners in the industry. And so that's kind of the proof of the pudding there. Number 5, LtC approved long-term care communities are, run down. You wouldn't want your worst enemy living there. Their food is terrible. So I would just say that there are some LtC communities out there that are, not really the most luxurious places in the world. There's also non-LtC communities that are not particularly luxurious, and you wouldn't want to put your worst enemy there either. There are, from our experience, plenty of nice LtC approved communities. You just have to know where they are. And sometimes you have to go a little bit further out of your geographic preferences to go to the LtC community that makes the most sense for you. But there's plenty of them out there. There's big communities that take LtC. There are, little group homes that take LtC, and some of them are genuinely pretty nice. The last myth: the people working at LtC are rude. They take 2 weeks just to return a phone call, and by then it's too late to get the answers we need. All they want to do is just decline applications. We've been working with LtC for years, and the people there are some of the most overworked. It's insane the amount of work that they pile on these people. It really is. So their job is to work through the applications. Again, they don't provide guidance. They want to approve the applications that are approvable. And frankly, they want to decline the applications that are in need of being declined because the person's not eligible. The faster they can work through that workload, the faster they can get the eligible people on the program. So that's the truth of the situation. The LtC staff, what we found, just wants to be treated with some respect and courtesy and given an LtC application that's crisp, clear, concise, and complete. And that's kind of, one of the things that we specialize in, is giving them an application that they know they can approve the minute that they see it. Okay, so moving on to qualifications. So again, there's 2 main eligibility components for the LtC program: medical, which I'll cover, and financial, which Katie will cover when I'm done with medical. It's important to note, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to mention it again, you have to be found eligible for both. You have to be found eligible for medical and financial. You can't have one or the other. So you have to have both. I'm going to cover the medical piece, and I've got an acronym after medical here called PASS, and I'm just going to mention what that is. It's pre-authorization screening, which is the eligibility process that LtC uses to determine whether an applicant is eligible or not. Pre-authorization screening, or it's also known as the PASS assessment. On the financial side, just to kind of tee up what Katie's going to talk about, there's 3 pillars of sub-eligibility under financial. There's income, again, Katie will talk about that. Resources, which is your assets, your accumulated assets over the years. Remember, Ernest and Charlene had $700,000 of accumulated resources plus their house and a car. And then, of course, there's the 5-year look back, which I mentioned earlier during the myths, that kind of penalizes you for having given away cash or cash equivalents or property. So Katie's going to talk about all that stuff. I'm going to jump into the medical. So first of all, the LtC applicant has to pass the medical assessment called the PASS, the pre-authorization screening. The mechanism for the PASS used to be done in person. And then ever since March, April of 2020, because of COVID, they've shifted the process to be done typically over the telephone. So there's going to be eligibility coordinator or a PASS clinician from the LtC office who's going to call, and they're going to want to talk to the applicant, assuming the applicant is cogent, and the applicant's caregiver or caregivers, and then any other people that are involved in being the authorized representative on the application, which is typically us. The PASS is a combination of both functional and medical factors. Functional means they're actually scoring your ability to handle the activities of daily living. The more assistance you need with those activities of daily living, the higher you're going to score. And the passing score that you're looking for in order to be found eligible on the medical is 60 points or above. On the medical side, they're looking at things like your medical records from all of your doctors, any hospital visits that you've had, the medications that you take, any medical devices that you use, and any care plans that have been prepared for you by in-home care providers or community, assisted living, memory care, et cetera. So all of that taken together is going to determine your eligibility. The functional score, if you're found at 60 or above, boom, you're automatically eligible. It doesn't matter what your medical records really show, as long as they back up the 60-point score. Obviously, you can't score 60 based on the strength of your interview, and then the PASS assessor looks at your medical records and your medical records say you're on a professional soccer team. That's not going to fly. So the purpose of the PASS is for LtCs to make sure that the people that are ending up on the program are eligible from a medical perspective. And what that means is that you're expected to need a hands-on level of institutional care. If you're somebody who is, if you need med management, or you need what's called an observational level of care, which means we think you might be a fall risk, but generally you're pretty good about moving around and putting your clothes on and eating and dressing and bathing and all that stuff. But it's nice to have somebody sitting off to the side just in case something goes wrong. That's observational, and that is not going to find you to be eligible for the program. You're eligible for the program if you're having somebody hands-on helping you with, again, mobility, transferring, bathing, eating, toileting, dressing, all of those things that we talked about earlier as ADLs. One of the things that do you want to talk about the pre-screen? Actually, I feel like you do a better job of that.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that our firm does, and again, I would encourage you to make sure that now or in the future, if you engage with an LtC planning firm, that this is something that they do for you. Make sure that they go through a medical pre-screen process with you or your loved one. The last thing that anyone wants to have happen is for you to invest in hiring a firm that can get things done on the financial side. We can control things there the way that we need to control them. We only have so much control over the medical eligibility side of things. We can make sure we do talk about certain things, and we can make sure that we maybe don't talk about other things. But at the end of the day, we need the applicant to be at a certain level of care like John's describing in order to realistically be found medically eligible. And so because we don't want someone to invest in hiring us and then not be found medically eligible, that would be horrible. We put in a lot of time and effort doing our due diligence on the front end to make sure that a potential new client is medically eligible before we move forward in the process. And what we go through in order to accomplish that is we have a member of our team, Tammy, who's actually a retired LtC medical assessor. So she's joined up with our team since leaving the LtC office, and she does what we call a medical pre-screen with all of our potential new clients, where she goes through conversations with the caregiver, whether it's a family member or someone at an assisted living home or community. She's looking at the service plan, if there is one, if there are in-home care records. And she's basically saying, if I still worked for the LtC office and this person had been assigned to me to assess, this is exactly how I would have scored them. And we can see where that person ends up totaling up. If they get to 60 points or above based on Tammy's assessment, then we know that there's a really high likelihood that they're going to be found medically eligible, and it makes sense to continue forward in the process. If we find out that they're really more at like 50 points right now or 40 points, then we've got that baseline set, and we can explain to the family, we can explain to the caregiver if these things were to happen or change over the next few weeks or months, whatever the case may be, this is when you want to come back and check in with us again to see if your loved one is now where they need to be in order to be found eligible. The one thing I would just add on to what John was explaining is that if someone has a cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's or dementia, an official diagnosis from a neurologist, typically the testing to support that, then that can actually count substantially towards the 60 points. And there are other ways that someone could also earn points towards that 60-point total through maybe things like wandering, resistive behavior towards self-care, disruptive behavior. Sometimes people with Alzheimer's and dementia end up having self-injurious behavior or aggressive behavior towards others. And so that's an opportunity to earn points as well. So if someone does have a dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis and is exhibiting some of these corresponding behaviors, they might not actually need a hands-on level of help with activities of daily living. It might actually be able to be more supervisory, cueing, reminders, things of that nature, because they have enough points being earned due to the cognitive impairment.
All right, good segue into the financial.
All right, hopefully you guys aren't tired of hearing me talk since I just kind of took over there for a little bit. So switching gears to the financial eligibility side of things, in order to be financially eligible for the LtC program, an applicant needs to be below the monthly income limit. They need to be below the resource limit, which, as John explained earlier, resources is what's we know typically more as assets. And they also need to have not transferred assets, property, wealth of any kind to another person or entity within the past 5 years without receiving comparable value in return. So if money was not spent for the applicant's benefit and that surfaces in the LtC application process, then there can be a corresponding delay in when LtC coverage will start. So that's what John was referring to in terms of the 5-year look back. LtC is looking at the 5 years prior to applying for the program and saying, in the past 5 years, have you gifted anyone money, loaned anyone money, taken your name off of any accounts, redeeded property into your children's name instead of your name, things of that nature. So all of those things are important to take into consideration when you're applying for the program.
Yeah, and the 5-year look back tends to confuse people. And so we've got an example here that we want to share with you because it's not necessarily the most straightforward concept to understand. So will you take this over?
Yeah, so basically what it comes down to is Medicaid anywhere, LtC here in Arizona, does not want people to just divest themselves of their assets in order to become financially eligible for the program. If we could all just give our money away until we have $2,000 and be financially eligible for the LtC program, a lot of people would do that. And given that, you know, it's a government program that's funded by taxpayer dollars, we don't have unlimited dollars to be providing recipients of the program. And so it's important for LtC to have some kind of means in place, a process in place to say, if you did give away your money in order to accelerate your financial eligibility, that's okay, but we're going to have to delay your coverage starting because we just can't afford to have everybody doing that and receiving LtC benefits right from the get-go. So the rule is we're going to look back 5 years and see what, if anything, have you given away or taken your name off of. This number changes every single year, but for 2022, it's every $8,030 that's been transferred away in the 5 years leading up to applying for the program is going to cause a 1-month delay in LtC coverage starting. So you can apply for the program, you can have your application approved, but if you've given $32,000 away over the last 5 years, then LtC is going to say your long-term care coverage starts 4 months down the road. Yeah. So application's approved, long-term care coverage start date is delayed. So here's an example. An applicant owned a $500,000 home valued at that in July of 2018. They paid off their mortgage, owned the home in full, and they decided that they wanted the house to remain in the family. So they deeded the home to their kids and just remained living in the home. We hear this all the time, by the way. For some reason, people think that if they want to protect their home from Medicaid and be able to qualify for the program and have the house stay in the family, or the proceeds from the house stay in the family upon their passing, that it's okay to redeed property into the kids' names. It's absolutely not. It needs to be taken into consideration in part of the planning process. So in this case, they transferred the home to their child, went and applied for the LtC program in July of 2021. 5 years had not passed since July 2018 when they redeeded the home into the child's name. LtC sees this. They have access to property records, the tax assessor's records. They can see all of this in their system. So they know that the home was transferred. They know that it was valued at $500,000 at the time, and they would have calculated a 62-month transfer penalty at the time.
Because 8,030 divided into $500,000 is 62 roughly.
Right.
Yeah.
So obviously that would be devastating. If someone needs the LtC program, they need their long-term care costs covered, the gap between their income and their cost of care, they have $2,000 to their name, and now their long-term care coverage isn't starting until over 5 years down the road. What's going to happen? So these are the types of things that are important to educate you and your friends about in advance, so that these things aren't being done. If they are going to be done, they're part of a much larger comprehensive plan where we can make sure that things happen properly in the way that they need to still have a good outcome for you, the client. In this situation, the applicant would have actually been better off holding off on waiting to apply for the LtC program. If they're going to apply for LtC now and incur a 62-month transfer penalty, they would have been better off waiting to apply for LtC until July of 2023, August 2023, when they had satisfied that 5-year look back. They'd exceeded it. And we see things like this happen all the time, unfortunately, where people come to us because an application was declined for some reason. They want us to fix it. We find out that this property transfer had been previously reported, and it's too late at that point. It's like you guys would have been better off, unfortunately, if you had just waited another couple of years to apply for the LtC program in the first place. So people can open cans of worms, unfortunately, when they're not well-versed in how to navigate these types of situations. In a situation like this, if it's possible, the applicant could take the house back from the child. The house could be redeeded back to the parent's name from the child. We unfortunately see situations all the time where maybe it was sold and the proceeds were distributed to the grandchildren because that's what the grandparents' wishes were. It's not possible to corral all of that back at that point in time and fix the problem. But if the house still exists, then it could be retitled back in the LtC applicant's name, and it would then be an exempt asset. Or like I was mentioning, it might actually be a better strategy to just wait another couple of years and not have to report the transfer of the home to the LtC office at all. Whether the applicant is married or unmarried is going to make a huge difference in financial eligibility. The criteria is very different for an unmarried person than for a married couple. So just something to note. I don't know, do you want to get into the details of that, or is that?
No, just I mentioned that here just because we're going to cover separately unmarried people, and then we're going to cover married people because those eligibility requirements are so different. So we'll start with unmarried.
Okay. So an unmarried individual needs to have no more than $2,523 a month of gross income. I stress gross because it is before anything's withheld. So Medicare Part B premiums, if taxes are being withheld from a pension, maybe LtC is looking at the pre-tax monthly income. This figure does change every year as well for inflation. So this is for 2022, the figure. Next year, it'll be a little bit higher. An unmarried applicant is not able to have more than $2,000 in counted assets in their name. Exempt assets are things like a primary residence, one vehicle, prepaid funeral expenses, as long as they're treated properly, they do need to be set up properly in order for them to be exempt. Anything else is going to be counted. So bank accounts, retirement accounts, if you have stocks, bonds, mutual funds, annuities with a cash value, life insurance with a cash value, CDs at the bank, anything that has
summer homes, rental homes.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Multiple vehicles, multiple properties, timeshares, vacant lots, you name it. So anything outside of these few items that are listed down below is going to be a counted asset.
One thing I'll mention, and it's kind of an outlier, but I'll mention it just because it comes up from time to time. Anything outside of the United States is not considered a counted asset as long as Altex doesn't know about it. So if you have an account in Bermuda, or if you have a home in Puerto Rico, or if you've got a beach chalet down in Costa Rica, Altex isn't going to find out about that. So generally, if you don't mention it, they won't find out and it won't be counted. But obviously, if it's in the 50 United States, whether it be a bank account or a piece of property or anything else, they have their ways of finding out about it. So those will obviously factor in. So this is an over income situation here.
Yeah, so one of the things to just be aware of is that if an applicant's income does exceed that monthly cap, on the surface, Altex would have to decline an application just for that reason. But there's a workaround, because again, if income is $2,600 a month, cost of care is $5,000 a month, and I don't have any assets in the bank to cover that gap, I still need the Altex program. So there's a solution that the attorneys have come up with over the years called an income-only trust. It's also known as a Miller trust. Those terms are interchangeable. And that trust is a solution to being over the income limit. So just know that you can still qualify for the Altex program if on the surface you appear to have too much income.
Yeah, we've got a whole example of that here, which I don't know if you want to cover that or not, but I think actually we skipped covering that, didn't we? Yeah, we did. My bad. Moving on.
We're running a little short on time here. I know
yes.
we want to answer your questions. So bottom line is there are just a number of strategies that can be implemented for an unmarried applicant who's over the resource limit. They do not have to spend down to $2,000 in counted assets. Just know that. You will hear left and right that you have to do that. You absolutely do not. There are a number of strategies that we implement with our clients on a daily basis where we can protect and preserve assets without spending down to $2,000 and still qualify the individual for the program. For a married couple, Altex is going to look at the combined marital income and say $2,523 a month times 2 is $5,046. So are you below that as a married couple? If so, eligible for the program. If the applicant themselves is below $2,523 a month without looking at their spouse's income, then they're also eligible for the program. So there are a couple of different ways to determine income eligibility for an individual who's part of a married couple. For as far as the resources go, the applicant themselves needs to be at or below $2,000 in counted assets, like we talked about in the Ernest and Charlene example. And then there's going to be a calculation done to determine what the community spouse resource allowance is for the healthy spouse. So again, it was determined that Ernest was allowed to have a certain amount of money. And so half the marital assets up to a maximum of $137,400 is what that breaks down to. If we're looking at a married applicant and they're over the income limit, it's the same Miller trust or income only trust strategy that we would utilize as with an unmarried individual. And then, as we talked about, we have a number of strategies that can be implemented when a married couple is over the resource limit so that they do not have to actually spend down to $2,000 and $137,000 respectively. So there's no such thing as having too many assets for Altex. It doesn't, we have clients who have had $1.2 million in counted assets that we have been able to protect for the healthy spouse and qualify for the Altex program. And I know that might sound odd and you wonder, why would someone like that need the Altex program? But this particular situation was a 51-year-old woman with a 13-year-old daughter at home who was still working full time, trying to save for retirement and her daughter's college education. And her 63-year-old husband had the worst case of Alzheimer's I've ever seen in my entire life. And he was very physically healthy aside from the Alzheimer's diagnosis. And so this woman, Barb, was terrified that her husband would live 20 plus years and she'd be writing a currently $6,000 a month check to the memory care community that would increase by probably 5% a year for the next 20 years. And she wouldn't be able to afford to retire herself. So bottom line is there's no such thing as having too much money for the LtC program. You want to summarize?
I'll summarize and then we'll get to your questions. So as far as the PASS approach or the PASS assessment, we didn't talk about this specifically, but the best advice that I can give if you're going to go about the LtC application is when you're answering questions, if you're the caregiver or if you're answering the questions for yourself, you want to answer the questions that they're asking you in the context of what are you like on your worst day? Because everyone knows, you know, that some days they feel great and some days they don't. It's going to be the days when you're struggling, when you're going to end up in the hospital. And remember, the whole purpose of LtC is to kind of defend and protect against ending up in the hospital because of injuries or what have you. So the right way to go about the PASS, being honest, of course, is to answer the questions in the context of your worst day. Using the appropriate strategy for your situation. And when that strategy is implemented correctly to the letter and all that documentation is shared with the LtC office, virtually anybody can be eligible for LtC. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't. No one is too rich for LtC if it makes sense for you to be on the program in your particular situation. Asset preservation is key. Frankly, our firm, Stronghold Financial, that's our specialty, is where we're trying to protect people like Ernest from going broke, paying for care for their spouse. I can't emphasize this next one enough. The sooner you start planning, I don't care if you're 50 years old, I don't care if you're 60 years old, I don't care if you think that this isn't going to happen to you. The sooner you start planning, the more flexibility, the more options, the more creativity we can use in planning out your future and how you're going to pay for all this stuff should it happen. One thing I can promise you that we'll never do is implement a strategy that's going to paint you into a corner where if for some reason you don't need the LtC program, you're in a bad situation. We won't do that. We don't do that. We are fiduciaries. We're going to do what's in your best interests. And it's really important to know that if you can give us some leeway, if you can give us some runway, if you can give us some time, we can work some pretty magical stuff for you. And as you probably figured out by now, this stuff is complex. So if you can, if it's not us, fine, but engage an expert. Find somebody who you trust, who knows this stuff, who's got an amazing spotless track record and a great reputation. Engage them and get them on the case. All right. So I'm going to go through these questions and I may call on you. So get ready. Let's start with the first one here. Okay. First question is, will the slides be available? I don't know. I don't know.
I'd be happy to share them with everybody if you want to make them available to me. I can.
You comfortable with that?
I am, yeah. I mean, and again, I know this is going to be recorded as well, and the recording is going to be circulating. I just want to stress that what we talked about today was specific to an individual's situation. So just please don't take the information and go try to implement it yourself in a way that might do more harm than good. It's really important to have all of the nuances of your specific situation talked through with a professional.
100%. Okay. Will you explain how a single person, a widow, can qualify for LtC without having to use the spend down approach? Can they move some money into an annuity in a beneficiary's name? You want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm by no means trying to avoid answering this question or beat around the bush, but I would say that it's very challenging to answer what would be the appropriate way for that to happen for one specific person. I can give you an example. We have a woman who specializes in reverse mortgages that refers her clients to us when appropriate. And I was talking with her this morning about an unmarried woman who had an incident happen at home, lives by herself, had been independent previous to this incident. She ended up being hospitalized for a few weeks. She's been in a skilled nursing rehab facility since the hospital. And the hospital or the rehab facility is now saying, you're ready to be discharged, but we will not be discharging you home until you have 24-hour a day, 7-day a week care. So is that going to happen inside of your home, or are you going to look at an assisted living community or group home setting for the time being until we can see if you maybe improve and are able to live independently again? And in this woman's case, she has a reverse mortgage on her home. She has about $125,000 in her bank account right now. And as an unmarried person, she's not able to have more than $2,000 in counted assets in order to be eligible for the program. We're actually able to utilize her reverse mortgage as part of her spend down strategy. So she can take the $123,000 that's currently putting her over the asset limit and put it into the reverse mortgage. The cool thing about that is she's able to pull that money back out as needed to have access to it. So she can take money out of the reverse mortgage line of credit almost as an income every month. But LtC doesn't treat reverse mortgage payments as true income. They look at Social Security and pensions as income, not reverse mortgage withdrawals. That's considered converting an asset. You're just spending an asset essentially. So we're going to be able to qualify her for the LtC program without having to utilize an annuity like you had asked in your question, simply through a tool that she already has implemented in her life. Not everyone has a reverse mortgage on their property. Not everybody is best suited to have a reverse mortgage on their property. So I wouldn't just rush to suggest that for everyone. Not everybody, even if they did have a reverse mortgage, this solution wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for them. So again, we really don't implement cookie cutter solutions. It's really important not to do that. We've had clients come to us before from other LtC planning firms for a second opinion. And the cookie cutter solution that was suggested to them by the other LtC planning firm would have, at the end of the day, cost the married couple tens of thousands of dollars in almost like hidden fees to implement that plan. We want to make sure that what we are implementing for you is customized for your specific situation, all of your moving parts, and is dialed in so it's the best outcome for what you're going through.
Yeah, and I think Katie covered this pretty well, but I want to be very overtly clear. We're not a mortgage broker. We don't sell reverse mortgages. In the situation, in the case that Katie's referring to, the reverse mortgage was already there, and we just leveraged it as a sensible part of the plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Is there a time? Hey, Laurel, I know you. Is there a time requirement, as in number of years as an Arizona resident, to have access to this benefit? So I can take this one. Really, the answer is no. The requirements are you have to have your physical feet on the ground on Arizona soil, and you need to have an address that you can point to say, this is my domicile, this is my home address. It doesn't have to be a residence. It could be a care community. It could be a group home. It could be a child's house. So as long as you have an address to point to and you're physically here, you can qualify for LtC. We've literally had people, we had a son whose mom was in Michigan. He flew her down to Arizona and was waiting on the doorstep of the LtC office at 9 a.m. in the morning to qualify her for LtC. She'd been in the state for an hour by the time that they applied. And they pointed to her son's address as her residence here in Arizona. And that's totally fine to do.
The one thing that I will throw in there that can be a little different about that though, Laurel, because I don't know what you do for a living. It sounds like John knows you. Okay.
Yeah, she's in home care.
So, I mean, we do have some skilled nursing facilities, for example, that refer their patients to us. And sometimes the patients are flown in from out of state because maybe certain machinery isn't available that they need in their home state, or people are on vacation and things unfortunately happen and they're kind of stuck here. So if someone does own a home property in a different state, there can be challenges with that. So again, just know that there are still nuances to situations where it's not always that cut and dry.
Yep. Neighbors Who Care just pointed out that they're recording this video. So we can certainly share the slides with you, but we'll also share the recording. If you send an email to Cheryl, SHERYL @neighborswhocare.com, she will send you the recording of this presentation to watch as many times as you like. Okay, next question. If a 90-year-old widow currently in an independent living community does not qualify for LtC based on her ADLs, still relatively independent with some help from an adult child for basic life needs, but the money is dwindling down, is there a possibility of qualifying for LtC at some point? Is it strictly based on the ADLs? The assumption, of course, is that the widow will ultimately end up needing ADL help, but the timing of that is unknown and the money is dwindling down. Yeah, this is tough. I'm going to let you take this one, but I just want to say at a high level, the medical eligibility and the financial eligibility have to happen at the same time. If somebody is financially eligible, they've spent all their money and they're not medically eligible yet, the LtC program isn't available to them. It's just not, unfortunately, and it stinks. I mean, we see this fairly frequently, and there's really no good advice that we can give other than we know that a person's medical condition, again, ebbs and flows, but there's usually a general trend. And if it's trending down and we can get doctors to write notes and we can get care plans that are showing a more aggressive level of hands-on care. And that's one thing that we can do is we can work with caregivers to say, hey, on their worst day, what kind of care are they going to need? And can you draw up a care plan that's consistent with that level of care on their worst day? Sometimes we can squeak somebody across the eligibility finish line. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but.
It's tough. I mean, unfortunately, there's not a program for that gray area where someone's not medically eligible yet, but still not able to live independently on their own. And so there's no easy answer to that. I mean, we do see it relatively often with individuals who are referred to us where we maybe have to start looking at a different living situation. No one wants to have to move, obviously, but if we can get the individual into a less expensive living situation where they can stretch their assets out for longer, then hopefully by the time the assets are dwindling down to the point that there's really nothing else left to cover the gap between income and cost of care, hopefully by then they are medically eligible. And we stay in close contact over time. You know, everyone knows, reach out to us if something drastic happens that changes their situation, but we're going to kind of check in with you on a quarterly basis and just make sure that nothing falls through the cracks because life gets busy. Because we want to make sure that we do go try to achieve the medical eligibility as soon as it is feasible to do so.
Right. A fiduciary is a person or organization that acts on behalf. Oh, you're just giving the definition of fiduciary.
Yes,
I'll read
I
this.
just thought I'd put that in there because.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
smart. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll read it out. A fiduciary is a person or organization that acts on behalf of another person or persons, putting their client's interests ahead of their own with the duty to preserve good faith and trust. So I described Katie and me and our firm, Stronghold Financial. We are fiduciaries. So that means we live, eat, breathe, sleep, and swear to act in the best interests of our clients, even to our own detriment, if it turns out that way. So that means that when it comes time to actually do your LtC plan, we're not looking to benefit ourselves other than to be remunerated for our time and expertise, obviously. But the plan we're putting together is going to be the very best plan for you. And our fiduciary status is sort of speaking to that.
Very important. A lot of folks don't understand that. And especially with it like investments and stuff, which is totally different than what you're doing, but they don't often see that someone who is an advisor could potentially be just a salesperson and
Right.
not looking out for your own.
Now you mentioned this, and I'll actually thank you for that. I actually am an investment advisor, a wealth advisor, and I am a fiduciary wealth advisor. So that's also part of our business.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to say anything more about it because it's
Right.
inappropriate, right? But I just wanted
Maybe
to.
that's another talking session. So.
That's another talking session. I won't say anything more about it, but I just did want to mention that.
I think the point is that that's the approach that we take in all aspects of our business. I really primarily focus on the LtC side of the business. John does focus primarily on the wealth management side, and the two coincide when appropriate. But It's the same fiduciary responsibility approach that we take across all fronts of our business, because quite frankly, it's just the right thing to do.
Correct.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a good place to end.
Yes, and thank you very much. So on behalf of Katie and me, and you can speak for yourself here, but we thank all of you, neighbors who care, especially for putting this together, the audience there. Thank you for your great, thoughtful questions. We hope this was helpful. As a call to action, if you want to just email info@strongholdfin, Fin as in financial, we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for your time today and for educating our audience. As you all know, we like to bring community education to our groups, our audience, and the community to make new friends. And this is just our final of this speaker series. The next one will be in the summer, July and August. So we'll be in touch to let you know what those topics are and who those speakers are at that time. Thank you again, Jonathan and Katie. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you maybe on a future talk.
Lovely.
Definitely,
We would
yeah.
love that.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
And for the rest of you, I will be downloading this and uploading it to YouTube, and then putting that YouTube link in an email to all of you in the event that you want to share it or take another look at it.
All right. Thanks,
All righty.
everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.